I have been following the caravan of Central Americans that are slowly inching toward the U.S. southern border in order to request asylum. Sadly, these desperate travelers are being viewed as criminals, and words of hatred toward the poor seem to be acceptable in today's society. But if you read the words of Jesus about those that are poor, you will see that's not how he thought of them at all. Jesus taught, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in marketplaces and have the best seats in houses of worship and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearances, they say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. Jesus then went and sat down across from the treasury, and he watched as people came and put their money into the treasury. Now, many rich people came up and they put large sums of money because they had quite a bit to give. But then a poor widow came up, and she put in just 2 small copper coins, which are worth about a penny. After Jesus saw this, he called his disciples and he said to them, "You know, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she gave out of her poverty and has put in everything she had, all that she had to live on." This is found in the Gospel of Mark, if you want to follow up on Mark 12. But this is one of the many passages, though, that Jesus not only has sympathy for the poor, but lifts them up as examples of how we are to live our lives. And I'm not advocating for anybody to be a widow or to be destitute as they were in the time of Jesus. But we certainly as a society have strayed from looking upon those that are less fortunate, those that are facing poverty or homelessness and hunger. We seem to think that if only they worked a little bit harder, they wouldn't be in this situation. And somehow this caravan of poor asylum seekers has somehow become an attack on our borders of America. And this caravan happens every year. It's not something new. It happens every year. And mostly it's a political statement to bring plight to the people in the South American countries and the poverty they face and the violence. But how did we ever get to such a spiritual place when we look down upon people that are poor or seeking asylum? We seem to have a complete lack of sympathy, much less any sense of how their model of strength, determination, and sacrifice, how much they are willing to give in order to come and hopefully reach a place where they can be free. I believe that when we look at people with a lack of sympathy and look at them as invading our country, it weakens Christianity, it weakens our country's moral leadership, and I believe it weakens us as individuals. Yeah. And I'm not saying we all have to go out and save the world, but sometimes changing our attitude around things that are occurring. Journalists who have been traveling with this caravan of people are reporting back on stories of families and the violence they have left behind, and the extreme poverty and the fear in which they live. He hasn't run across any criminals yet. Most of them are very poor people, mothers, fathers, young children. So instead of asking the question, well, what are we going to do with all these immigrants when they come to our border? Maybe the question we should be asking is, how will we respond spiritually to those who are poor and seeking asylum? How can we work together to see that the poor are treated as human beings, just like we would wish our own families and friends to be treated if they were in the same situation? Because I believe that is what Jesus does, and that is certainly what Jesus teaches us. There is a gospel story of a widow who gave what little bit of money she had, of money for a higher purpose, not unlike the mother from Honduras, who spends her last coins to undertake a journey that would take her children to a safer place. Now, Jesus praises the widow and those who are considered the least of these, those who are in extreme poverty, and he elevates the poor as those who will inherit the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. The praising that Jesus gives of the poor reminds those of us who will listen that we have much to learn from people who live in extreme poverty. We can learn from the poor what it means to be dependent on God and on the kindness of others. We can learn from the poor what it means to move forward with hope and courage for a better tomorrow. We can learn from the poor what it means to live on very, very little and to make that count. And we can learn from the poor what it means to share all you have. Back in the day when I would drive unreliable vehicles, they would often break down. And this is back before I could even afford AAA. I was in my 20s at the time. You know, it was, people would stop and help, and it was always seemed to be the people that were driving clunkers like mine. And they always came up with the best fixes for it. That didn't cost me a lot of money. It was always very nice, but they were the ones that would stop. They were the ones that would stop to see what they could do to help. I think the story in the Gospel of Mark about the widow tells the truth. That we as a society are very good at ignoring the widows, both because we really don't want to hear from her, and because to help her might demand the kind of sacrifice that she herself demonstrated. Would we want to give our last 2 coins to the work of God? If that's all we had to live on this week, we'd give our last 2 coins for the work of God. What would that look like for us? There's a thin line that we walk between pitying somebody and having empathy for them. Between feeling good about ourselves and having compassion. Between a kind of mandated kindness because we're supposed to be kind, to instead someone who exhibits true mercy to others. And another truth about ourselves, we hold the widow up to heights that make it easy for us to forget who she truly was and who she truly is. We would never be like that widow who became so poor, but in the time of Jesus, widows were among the very poor because they had no one to support them. And they really didn't have the means to go and change their situation. Women didn't work back then unless it was in the oldest profession, which shall go unnamed at the moment. But I believe that all of this, you know, it said that we have enough resources to solve poverty.
That's true.
And we do. But there's something else that really has taken over our society. Because we are all caught in the middle of a system that's vying for power. Yeah. And we're caught in the middle of people who desire power. And in the end, that's why we don't want to be like that widow at all. Because she has no power. And the thought of having no power is not very comforting. Power is everything. If you ask people would they rather have power or money, they'll say power, because with power they can get money. And the way our world is being constructed today, power is everything, and those with it are elevated to the highest standards. And people will do anything to maintain power, selling their souls out to the highest bidder, even selling their souls to those who will tell them they can have the best seats in church and a place of honor at the banquet. Now, if you don't have any power, it means others have more power than you do. If you do have a lot of power, perhaps through your job, through your financial status, it means others have less power than you do. And when you have been shaped by powerlessness, as somebody who has lived up without any power, you often have very little choice but to place your trust, your hope, your livelihood, and authorities or politicians who claim they have your best interest at heart. You hope they will do right by you. In our reading from Genesis today, the Tower of Babel, we look upon it as a kind of the story that talks about how we got so many different languages. And why that's true, it can be held up for that. I think really the towers of power, as I like to call them, as they built the skyscraper taller and taller and taller so they could reach right up to God in the heavens above. I think the story tells us that the human race, instead of managing to keep to its own boundaries, always longs for more and more and more and reaches out for greater and bigger and better things. We chase after the things in this world in order to acquire them for ourselves, much like power, wealth, and status. We buy bigger TVs and the newest cell phone that comes out. We may trade in our car every year because we want to have the newest model that we're driving. More and more and more. More wealth, more prestige. And then as we get older, we realize we have way too much stuff, and what are we going to do with it? When we were at the Arts and Crafts Fair, Annie was unpacking some Santa Clauses, and I had just a moment of weakness, and I said, oh, I think I'm going to buy one. And, then I said, I made a pact quite a few years ago that I was not going to purchase anything that I had to dust. Now, clothes is another thing, I will admit that, but I will not purchase things that I have to dust. It just doesn't make sense, especially at this time in my life. Many of us who clamor for more and more and more often feel overwhelmed, overworked, and overstressed in our desire to pursue material things. Our perspective on how much we actually have is skewed by the immensity of images of what we ought to have, what we deserve to have, what we should have.
Yeah, sure.
Too often we focus on what we don't have, what we think we need, what we think we deserve, and by golly, when is God going to reward us with that? And yet, in the spirit of the prophets, Jesus continually condemns greed that leads others to wealth, greed that leads others to poverty. We currently live in a world where the gap between the rich and the poor widens every day. Many families live from paycheck to paycheck. Homes are foreclosed on while the banks get rich. The bad news for the poor is often good news for the wealthy. And the poor are often tempted just to give up hope altogether. And yet, when we look at the widow, we have hope, because that widow trusted God for her future needs, and she takes a risk and gives everything she has to support the work of God. And there's a lesson in that, because I believe that we always have enough when we share enough.
Amen.
And abundant giving leads to abundant living.
Amen.
Abundant giving leads to abundant living. I believe that our national and personal abundance comes with the call to great generosity to others. While certainly we need to care for the people in our own nation, we stifle our souls if we only care for our own and don't think about others.
All right.
And I believe the Nation First slogan is a recipe for disaster for all of us living on this one planet. The Native Americans teach us that we are all connected, that what happens to one of us happens to all of us. When a child in Africa dies of hunger, our children over here die from hunger also, maybe a different type. So what if we ask ourselves, how can we be wisely generous? And what are we willing to sacrifice so that others may receive adequate resources? I believe that when we share what little we have with God, or what a lot we have with God, we can do great and wonderful things. And perhaps we need to realize that the widow's mite was truly a gift to God, and realize that small things can be life-transforming if they're done with great love. Amen. God bless you.